Welcome to Long History Short, where we discuss the historical context needed to understand today's global politics. I'm your host, Brian Stahl. Beginning at the end of December 2025, a swell of protests spread across Iran due to economic malaise and widespread dissatisfaction with the Iranian regime. The Iranian government responded with massive force, slaughtering thousands of their own people. As of now, reports suggest that the protests have been quelled, although information from Iran is not necessarily reliable, and this may not be the last of the protests. Furthermore, as of this recording, the United States has moved naval, air, and ground forces to the area around Iran, threatening military strikes. We've already discussed the history of Iran, but of course, Iran does not exist in a vacuum, and one of the keys to understanding the country's history is understanding its relationship with its nearest neighbor, Iraq. Let's get started. Joining us today is Professor Charles Tripp. Dr. Tripp is Professor Emeritus at the University of London's School of Oriental and African Studies, where he also received his PhD. He has authored many books on the history and politics of the Middle East, and he is widely recognized as an expert on Iraq, having provided commentary on Iraq for BBC, NPR, The Guardian, and other media outlets. Welcome, Professor Tripp.
Brian, thank you very much for the very flattering introduction. Also, thank you.
Happy to have you here. So in 1980, Iran and Iraq got into a war with each other, a very bloody, awful war. And my understanding is that there had been a lot of tension between the two countries previously, but then in the late 1970s, there had been something of a reconciliation. What happened there? Can you explain that to us?
Well, the original territorial dispute between the countries goes back to the 1930s when Iran and Iraq signed a treaty which Iran regarded as deeply unfair because Britain was the major power in Iraq at the time, and therefore they thought British muscle had moved in on it. And the dispute, I mean, it seems rather sort of abstruse to people who live a long way away from it, but basically it's about who has the right to call sovereignty over the waterway that shares their common border in the south, called the Shatt al-Arab, which is where the Euphrates and the Tigris rivers meet. And in 1937, there was huge tension between the two countries, and a treaty was signed which recognized that the Iranian sovereignty would run up to the middle line of the deepest passage. That rankled with the Iranians, and in the early 1970s, the Shah of Iran, as it was then, believed he was much stronger. He had the oil wealth. He was a major ally of the United States and so on. And so he devised a way of getting that treaty revised. And one way of doing it was to use Iraq's weakness in the Kurdish region. So there was a Kurdish rebellion in Iraq in the 1970s. And Iran poured weapons, supplies, everything across the border. And so much so that the Kurdish rebels pinned down most of the Iraqi army and actually defeated them in many areas in the north of Iraq. So Iraq was getting desperate, and this was the leverage that the Shah needed. And the result was in 1975 in Algiers, a treaty was signed with Iran, between Iran and Iraq, authored by Saddam Hussein. And Saddam Hussein was the vice president of Iraq at the time, but he was effectively the ruler. His uncle or cousin was rather infirm, or at least under house, or not quite under house arrest yet. But anyway, he was rather out of the picture. So effectively, Saddam organized this treaty, and whereby under the treaty, the Iranians withdrew all support from the Kurdish rebels, which the rebellion promptly collapsed. And so Iraq could reassert its own control over the whole of Kurdistan in quite a brutal way as well, as you can imagine. So Iraq at the time broadcast that as a great victory, because they had destroyed the Kurdish rebellion, they had got an agreement with the Shah, and from then on, the relations were very good. But then, of course, a revolution started in Iran. And interestingly, when the Shah was getting increasingly worried about the emergence of revolutionary forces in Iran, among the religious scholars, mass demonstrations, he persuaded Iraq to expel Ayatollah Khomeini. Ayatollah Khomeini had taken refuge in Iraq in the 1970s, fearing persecution, quite rightly, in Iran itself, and become a vocal critic. And the Shah persuaded the Iraqis to expel Ayatollah Khomeini, which some people say is one of the most stupid things they ever did, because he was expelled to Paris. where he became an immediate target of the world media. So suddenly, this rather obscure scholar who, sitting in a religious city in Iraq, hadn't much contact with the outside world, suddenly became a kind of media superstar. Everyone wanted to interview him and so on. So actually, the Shah shot himself in his own foot, as it were, by doing that. But the point is that from Saddam Hussein had not wanted to see, and Saddam Hussein by then was president of Iraq officially. He'd become president in 1979. So by the summer of 1979, relations between Iraq and Iran were pretty terrible. The new revolutionary regime in Iran was calling, many members of it were calling for a revolution in Iraq next. The revolution had swept away the Shah. Now the revolution would sweep away all tyrants across the Middle East. And so increasingly, Saddam was nervous about that. So relations really deteriorated from 79, when the Shah was expelled in the early 79. It was really deteriorated from then. And so, in a sense, something that had been a kind of working, rare relationship, not exactly trust between Iraq and Iran, became deep anxiety about what Iran would try to do next. And of course, for Saddam, there was fear about what the Iranians might do in the Kurdish region. There was fear about the Shia groups in Iraq itself, some of which had already been outlawed and who were vociferous in their support for Khomeini. So it was a kind of a tinderbox in many ways. And at the same time, Saddam Hussein, having just become president of Iraq in 79, was very conscious of the fact that people would reproach him for having sold territory to Iran at the Treaty of Algiers. So this is why the territorial element comes back into the equation. And it's partly about the ability of Khomeini to stir up revolutionary thoughts and actions in Iraq itself, but it's also about his own fear about his own party and his own supporters regarding him as somebody who had basically ceded Iraqi territory to Iran in the mid-1970s.
I see. So it was a combination of internal weakness from Saddam Hussein on the one hand, and then a new ideologically driven regime from Iran. And this is sort of the tinderbox. Was there any particular spark that caused the outbreak of war?
There were a number of sort of clashes along the border, and they were much exaggerated by the Iraqis, played down a bit by the Iranians. But the worst thing that the Iranians did in many ways was, of course, that they were undergoing a revolutionary upheaval. And one of their targets was the Iranian army itself, the officer corps of the Iranian army. So Saddam Hussein, although he was fearful of the Ayatollahs in some ways, he could see that they were weakening Iran as a state. They had dismantled they dismantled parts of their officer corps. They'd chased people out of the country. Their major weapons supplier in the United States they'd had terrible relations. And of course, the hostage crisis that erupted at the American embassy sort of meant that no more weapons supply. So for Saddam Hussein, it was really opportunism. In other words, he saw that here was a state or a regime that could be powerful, but was really weak in the present. And what he thought was he would, as it were, use military force to squeeze concessions from them because they were at their weakest point, not understanding that, as somebody once said, never attack a revolution, which might be something that we're thinking about in the contemporary times as well. The problem was that the Iranian regime once attacked, and Saddam, who started the war, I mean, he rolled the tanks across the border. He rolled the tanks across the border in the autumn of 1980 and captured huge amounts of territory, but then sort of ran out of steam because the Iraqis thought that if they just captured large amounts of territory, he thought that was a bargaining chip. In other words, he thought you go in, you occupy a large amount of territory, and then the Iranians are bound to want to do a deal. And they didn't. They saw it as an attack on the revolution, an attack on God, as they would put it. And then they were locked into this terrible war. And quite interestingly, Saddam Hussein, quite a bit later, reflecting on the war with Iran, said, if someone had told me in September 1980 that this war would last forever, I would not have ordered our forces in. In other words, he thought it was going to be a 3-week war Iraq would capture a lot of territory, Iranians come to the negotiating table, and they would hammer out a deal, as had happened in 75. But he was dealing with a very different kind of regime. So basically, he found himself embroiled in this terrible war, which went on for 8 years.
And is that what you made the comment before, never attack a revolution? Is that basically what you meant? That because they were more ideologically driven, they weren't going to do the kind of normal calculation that a less ideological state might make?
Exactly. They were not calculating on territory wasn't important for them. What was important was the regime that had attacked them. And so immediately Saddam's forces invaded Iran. They started to call for revolution in Baghdad. They said, I think there was a slogan that the road to the liberation of Jerusalem lies through Baghdad. So basically, Baghdad first, Jerusalem next. It was going to be a massive, Islamic revolutionary war. And of course, ironically, 1980, the Iranian regime was in real trouble domestically. It had got rid of large numbers of officials. It got rid of, so it wasn't performing. It wasn't, and there were all sorts of splits within the regime. But of course, as soon as you invade a country, it tends to have the effect of creating a certain solidarity. So people, as it were, who might not have supported and who were very critical of Khomeini suddenly clustered around him and supported him in the teeth of what was regarded as Iraqi aggression. So it was if you attack a revolution, one of the dangers is instead of the revolution unraveling, it just becomes more solidified.
It might also spread into your borders. So that kind of leads me to my next question. Iraq is a majority Shiite state, and Iran's revolutionary regime was ideologically Shiite as well, whereas Saddam Hussein is a secularist. And especially given the fact that Iranians wanted to spread their revolution into Baghdad and into Iraq, how successful were they? Like, I mean, to what extent were people in Iraq sympathetic with this, or did a large chunk of Iraqis sympathize with the Iranians during this war?
Um, it's hard to put numbers on it, but there were certainly active um, parties in Iraq who were supportive of the Islamic Revolution in Iran and who had been, in fact, prescribed by Saddam Hussein to belong to any of those organizations became retrospectively cause for a death penalty. And so, in a sense, he was already attacking the very groups that were most supportive, it seemed, of the Islamic Revolution. And at the same time, there were others who were equally critical of Saddam Hussein. So he had driven a lot of the Islamist activist opposition underground, and many of them had fled into exile in Iran, where they found shelter and support. So he had those against him in many ways. And I think in some senses, they just grew during that period, because one of the things that was apparent is that when the tide of battle turned in 82 and the Iranians recaptured territory and recaptured large numbers of Iraqi prisoners of war, many of them were signed up to join the Mujahideen, the Asadrs, the Al-Hakim's outfit in Iran. So there was an organization called the Supreme Council for the Islamic Revolution in Iraq, and they became what are known now as the Badr Brigade Foundation, the people who became, again, one of the active militias in the last 30, 40 years. So there were considerable numbers of people. But of course, one of the interesting things is that just as you could say, the effect of attacking Iran made people cluster around Khomeini, interestingly, the majority of Iraq's armed forces were Shia, but they didn't necessarily want to support Khomeini or other Shia leaders. They just saw them as Iranian enemies. They spoke a different language. They were trying to kill them on the battlefield. So you defended yourselves. Maybe one of the mistakes that Khomeini made from his part was that belief that because people happened to be Shia, they would necessarily support the Islamic Revolution. And they didn't. And so large numbers fought very bravely against the Iranians. So the delusions, if you like, on both sides of the degree of popular support that the other could enjoy within the other country.
Yeah, that's a classic mistake of an authoritarian ruler, is to overestimate the breadth of your own support there. That makes a lot of sense. So now, can we turn, what was the United States' position during this war?
Well, initially, I think it was Kissinger who said, it's a pity they both can't lose. But of course, ironically, they did both lose the war. But his cynicism apart, The United States initially pretended not to be involved at all. But of course, they had the history of the overthrow of the Shah, their main ally. They had the vociferous attacks by the Iranian regime on American interests, and of course, the hostage taking in Iran as well. So there was a whole area where the enmity to Iran by the United States was probably greater than anything else. Weren't particularly enthusiastic at that stage about Iraq, because Iraq at that point was a Soviet ally, in the sense their armed forces were supplied by the Soviet Union. They were resupplied by the Soviet Union, although the Soviet Union, again, was appalled by what Saddam had done and wasn't exactly outspoken in its support of Iraq at the time. Within some areas, it became apparent that for some in the United States administration, they saw this as an opportunity not only to defeat Iran, but also a way of turning Iraq away from the Soviet Union. And in a sense, that had been beginning to happen in after the oil boom and the rest, when Iraq realized it didn't have to depend upon the Soviet Union; it could establish relations elsewhere. So relations with the United States became warmer and warmer, actually, and by well into the war, when it seemed that the tide of battle had turned in '82, and it really did seem as if Iran was going to invade Iraq, America became very, very worried indeed and began to resupply Iraq and got its Gulf allies to loan vast quantities of finance to Iraq. But there was a very strong American support. And in the end, America became militarily involved through the War of the Boats. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard and others were trying to attack the Gulf suppliers of arms and finance to Iraq. So the tankers had to go out through the Straits of Hormuz, which is that very narrow straits, into the Indian Ocean. And of course, they became very vulnerable to Iranian attacks by quite small boats, could do terrible damage to oil tankers and so on. So that's when the United States and its allies set up the naval patrols in the Gulf, which effectively took on the Iranian Navy, what was left of it. And in fact, American forces effectively destroyed the Iranian Navy, what was left of it, because it was seen as a threat to the oil. And the Iraqis, meanwhile, attacked Iranian oil platforms in the Gulf supplied by American and French intelligence and weaponry. So it became very much part of a war in which, ironically, America and indeed the Soviet Union were supplying Iraq to stop it falling to Iran. So the threat between 82 and 86 seemed to be very sharp indeed, that the Iraqi forces would collapse at the front and that the Iranians would actually win the war. They didn't, but it was clearly regarded as a possibility. So that's when America became very, very close to Saddam Hussein.
Wow, quite an irony given everything that came afterwards in the next 20 years or so.
There are a lot of embarrassing photographs at the time of Rumsfeld and others meeting Saddam, praising him for his steadfastness and so on, which is a kind of weird irony for 20 years later.
Very much so. So, just to close the loop on the Iran Iraq war, how did it finally come to a conclusion?
Well, that was part of the picture, the fact that the Iranians, from the sort of geostrategic point of view, began to realize that they were not fighting just Iraq. They became convinced that they were fighting America, which was not altogether wrong in terms of the suppliers of Iraq. But also, one has to remember that this was after it came to an end in the summer of 1988. And until 1987, there had been repeated Iranian offensives, incredibly costly in terms of Iranian lives, only minimally advantageous. They did capture the Fao Peninsula, which is in the south of Iraq, and that gave the Iraqis a huge shock as well. But they never broke through in the way that Khomeini hoped that they would break through. So what you'd had is about 4 years of terrible attrition, with these human wave attacks by Iranians trying to take Iraqi positions, like in the First World War. It might have moved the lines a few meters here, a few kilometers even sometimes, but not particularly. So the military advantage. And of course, one of the problems for Iranian leaders was that their supply operations or resupply operations were really complicated and problematic because nobody was going to supply them except from the open market. So they had to buy things. So they did get some very strange people resupplying them with elements like Israel, Soviet Union, American parts found their way there. I mean, all sorts of strange things. But generally, not always, but generally it was on the open market, whereas Iraq was getting this massive reinforcement from the United States, the Europeans, and the Soviet Union to resupply its forces. So I think the Iranian regime realized the cost of war. It also should be remembered that for the last previous 3 years, there had been no ceasefire plans on the table. The UN Secretary General had been quite active in trying to get both sides, but neither side would agree because each thought that they could get an advantage over the other. There came the summer of 1988, and there was a very famous and notorious incident when the United States destroyer, which was on part of the naval patrol, the USS Vincennes, shot down a civilian Iranian airliner, which was taking off from Abadan, which is a port flying to Bahrain. And it shot it down in mistake. They said they mistook it for a fighter jet taking off or something like that. Anyway, so it's often said that that incident convinced Khomeini that those who'd been arguing that it's time to sue for peace and come to a ceasefire agreement were right, because what it meant was now Iran was facing the Americans, and he didn't regard the Vincennes attack on the airliner as an accident. He regarded it as deliberate, and they were showing what they would now do to Iran. So under those circumstances, they felt that it was time to sue for peace.
Sounds wise to me. So, after the Iran Iraq war, the relationship between the two countries cooled down, and then everything changed between, well, really with the advent of the US invasion in 2003. Can you tell us? I know this is an enormously complicated and lengthy topic to digress about, but can you tell us a little bit, give us maybe a thumbnail sketch of why the United States invaded Iraq in 2003?
Well, you have to go back to 1990, 1991. There was the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, and then the war, which the Americans led, the UN force, but led by the Americans clearly, to liberate Kuwait, which succeeded in 1991 and totally defeated the Iraqi armed forces. And then there was an open uprising, rebellion in the south of Iraq. Many of the people around it was the elder Bush, who was the president of the United States at the time, reproached him for not taking it further and going for regime change in Baghdad, saying that we've betrayed the people of the South. They've now been massacred because the rebellion was crushed by Saddam Hussein, and we haven't gone in. So there was always that sort of repository in the United States that felt that the 1991 war was unfinished business. And so much so that by 1998, the Iraqi opposition, working with some of those disgruntled Republicans in Congress, had managed to get something called the Iraq Liberation Act passed in the United States Congress against the wishes of President Clinton, but he had to sign it because it was passed by Congress. And basically that pledged the United States to liberate Iraq from the tyranny of Saddam Hussein. It didn't say you should do anything about it at the time, but it sort of put it on the map, as it were. So then you get the next development is 9/11 and the attack on the Twin Towers and other targets in Washington and so on on 9/11. And although it was carried out by Al Qaeda, there were immediately people who began to spread the idea that it was inspired by Iraq, that it was Iraq's attempt to get revenge for the defeat of 1991. It's absolutely untrue. But there were a lot of people peddling this sort of intelligence, which seemed to make these very tenuous links between Iraq and Al Qaeda. But actually, there was no links between Iraq and Al Qaeda. And Al Qaeda, if one knew anything about either Ba'athi Iraq or Al Qaeda, were loggerheads with each other. There would no way. But it served the purposes of a number of people to try and mobilize the United States in the way that it mobilized to attack the Taliban in Afghanistan in the immediate wake of 9/11, to try and get them building up to a similar regime change operation in Baghdad. So it was a whole combination of factors, some of them purely fabricated, but clearly fabricated by people interested in bringing about regime change in Baghdad. And of course, in that, there were many Iraqis who were quite happy to encourage that view, who may not have been wildly enthusiastic about the United States invading their country, but felt that anybody who got rid of Saddam Hussein, that's fine by them because he was horrendous. I mean, his record in government had been terrible, terrible atrocities in Kurdistan and elsewhere. So, in a sense, there were a lot of voices usually in exile in Iraq, but also in Kurdistan. But voices in exile were often powerfully visible in Britain and in the United States. And they had quite an influence on the way in which many British and American legislators felt about Iraq and Saddam Hussein. So it was those combination of factors which really drove the decision to go to war.
Some of those people, as I recall anyway, were testifying before Congress. Oh, yeah, if you go in there, they'll be greeting you on the streets, there'll be parades, they'll be throwing flowers before you, all this stuff. And that was not exactly what happened. I mean, although I will say the initial invasion went fairly smoothly. And then after they had gone in there and taking care of the conventional military aspect of the fighting, that's when most of the real difficulties kind of set in. Can you tell us about some of that? What were some of the difficulties that the United States faced in their struggle against Iraq?
It says this that the Americans actually made those difficulties in some ways. They didn't make it in the sense that it was, of course, there were those who didn't want to see America anywhere near Iraq. But one of the major problems that they created in this brief to change the regime was with the appointment of Bremer as the sort of viceroy of the United States in Iraq, and his completely unwise decision to, in the name of de-Baathification, regime change, to disband the Iraqi army, to dissolve the Iraqi army. And of course, you dissolve the Iraqi army and you don't realize what the Iraqi army consists of. The Iraqi army, in fact, although it was in a bad shape anyway, but one of the key features of the Iraqi army is that it was often in its units recruited from very particular places. And so when you disband it and you deny them a pension and you effectively criminalize what they had been, you send them back to their communities, embittered, unemployed, and with access to the most massive quantity of weapons. Again, one of the things that it sort of baffles belief is how few of the major arsenals the United States actually policed. So they just helped themselves. And there's famous stories of the potato cellars of the southern Euphrates, where people used to store potatoes, and now became the great weapons storage areas for the insurgency, what became the insurgency. But it wasn't an insurgency at the time. I have a photo somewhere of a place about the size of 3 football fields in Baghdad, where there's weapons just all over it, just stored and weaving amongst these piles of tanks and boxes of ammunition and God knows what, are the little orange and white Iraqi taxis, Baghdad taxis, as people were going to help themselves to more and more stuff. So it was just, extraordinary. And one of the arguments about this is that the American High Command, or rather the Pentagon, didn't want to involve vast numbers of American troops. In other words, for the liberation of Kuwait, they assembled something like 500,000 or so close to that American forces in the Gulf area. To invade Iraq and to occupy Iraq, it was about a third of that. So although it was perfectly enough to defeat the Iraqi army, which was in really bad shape anyway, it wasn't enough to create a complete military occupation of the country. And if you don't create a complete military occupation of the country and you dissolve their own armed forces and you start to de-Baathify, which often meant getting rid of civil servants and government officials who had served their state, but they'd had to be members of the Baath. They weren't necessarily committed ideologues, but you treated them again as sort of criminals. You created this huge embittered reservoir of people who were also very well organized. They knew each other. They'd worked in the army and in the bureaucracy before, and they knew where to get weapons. So within about less than a year, the insurgency begins. And the insurgency at that stage was all kinds of groups: old Baathists, nationalists, secularists, Islamists, Shia and Sunni. I mean, just you name it. Anybody who felt they had a grudge could get hold of a weapon, and the person to blame, they thought, for all the grudges they had was the American soldier. And so they became the targets, as well as the Iraqis who collaborated with them.
It's very sad, very tragic, and what a waste and what a stupid decision, honestly. And it's also just strange where we took 500,000 troops for the initial Gulf War, which had much more limited aims versus so many fewer for such a more comprehensive and ambitious project. It's very, very bizarre looking at it retrospectively. So next thing I wanted to ask about was the insurgency and some of those groups, in particular the Shia groups like the Mahdi Army and other groups like that received aid from Iran. Can you tell us a little bit about how Iran aided the insurgency?
Well, the insurgency fell into different parts, depending on the part of Iraq you happen to be in. So, in the southern part of Iraq, it was the Mahdi Army, which was the Al Sadr organization, which had quite an ambivalent relation with Iran. I mean, in a sense, it was supported by them, but it wasn't 100% behind them. The more actively supported by Iran was the Badr Brigade, which was the Shia, as it were, the armed forces of the Supreme Council for the Islamic Revolution in Iraq, run by the Al Hakims, another prominent Shia family. And they were the ones who had a more direct link to the Iranian regime and the Revolutionary Guard. And I think that the Mahdi army always had a slightly problematic relationship with Iran, but Iran wouldn't hesitate to help them if they felt it would help them in doing so, creating trouble or defending Shia communities in the south. But the Mahdi army became a very strange sort of almost protection racket outfit in the south, in which the Americans were part of the story, or animosity to the Americans part of the story, but also animosity to other Iraqis and to other Shia. So it was a kind of insurgency of a sort, but not of the kind that, well, it did trouble the Americans. There were clashes, there were deaths on both sides, and there were determined efforts by the Americans to suppress it, not totally successfully. But the major part of the insurgency, as it began to develop in Anbar province and in the north, was not Shia at all, and not helped by Iran at all. So America was faced by two very different kinds of insurgency in the aftermath of the invasion. One which, in a sense, drew upon um, uh, Shia organizations that had existed before the invasion, had strong links with Iran. Others, which had no links with Iran, great enmity to Iran, came from the largely Sunni Arab populations of the north, of the west and the northwest.
That is quite a stew there for sure. Now, after the U.S. surged troops in, I believe, 2007, after a group of Iraqis in Anbar decided that they wanted to be more cooperative and more supportive of the United States for a variety of reasons, and after a broad rethinking of U.S. strategy to focus more on protecting civilians and not just trying to fight almost like a war of attrition, but trying to win the Iraqi civilian, the average Iraqi civilian, over to the kind of goals that we wanted to accomplish for the country, the levels of violence in Iraq began to decrease significantly. And in 2011, U.S. largely left the country. The Iraq War officially ended. What happened next? What happened after the United States withdrawal in 2011?
Well, the United States withdrew most of the bulk of their forces, but of course they'd left behind a political set of arrangements that they had overseen, which were, well, to put it kindly, very troubling for the Iraqis. They effectively left behind a system based upon sectarian identity. And that had been at the heart of much of the bloodletting that had happened in between 2004, 2008 in Iraq. The awakening groups that had been mobilized by the Americans in the western province of Anbar, they were trying their best to work, in the sense of protecting their communities. But they found that the prime minister in Iraq, who is actually al-Maliki, who is the one now who's being proposed as potential prime minister, whom the present president of the United States says will be denied all aid and so on. They're trying to stop it from happening. But the point is, he was prime minister then because he was the person who had Iran's support and he had American support at the time, because he seemed to be able to control things. But the way he controlled it was through violence and through patronage and corruption. And so, unfortunately, what looked like the Americans leaving behind a kind of parliamentary system with civilian control was anything but, was a deeply flawed, corrupt, and problematic and violent system in itself. And one of the features of al-Maliki and what they got up to was not only to disarm the Anbar awakening. So, in a sense, he didn't want these characters who didn't owe him any loyalty at all being armed and in a position to do anything. But he also started to insert his own relatives and proteges into the Iraqi army. And a lot of the Iraqi army didn't actually exist. It only exists on paper when they collect the salaries. And at the same time, he pursued deeply sectarian, anti-Sunni, anti-Arab Sunni policies. And this is what gave rise to Daesh, to Islamic State in Iraq, which was the uprising that really had begun to take off quite soon after the Americans left, from the same origins as many of the insurgent groups. And in fact, some of the leaders had been what they call graduate of the American internment camps that had been set up, because they had been interned but then released, and they went on to lead ISIS. And in 2014, the forces of the Islamic State overran the north of Iraq. They completely defeated the Iraqi army, committing horrendous atrocities along the way, and basically rolling up very close to Baghdad. And the desperation, both in Iran and in Baghdad and in Washington, about what this might mean, meant that there was a desperate attempt to kind of mobilize popular militias across Iraq to try and defend the south of Iraq against what seemed to be the inexorable advance of Islamic State forces in the west, in the north, and in the center. And they did stop them, and they stopped them partly because there was this massive mobilization of groups that sort of pre-existed. Ironically, some of them had been part of the Shia resistance to Americans before. Many of them had strong connections to Iran, and they've become, from 2014 onwards, they spearheaded the campaign to recapture and try and defeat Islamic State forces in alliance with American and British and other air support and Iranian logistical support as well on the ground. So for about 4 years, they were fighting northwards, sort of pushing back until eventually they managed to recapture Mosul and the towns of the north. But by then, these militias were part of the political landscape of Iraq. And many of them were Iranian agents. They were very supportive of the Iranian government. They were supported by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. And in a sense, they had come to stay. So ironically, thanks to the situation left when the Americans withdrew and the collapse of al-Maliki's government and the Iraqi armed forces, the terrain was left open to the militias that have now become very much a feature of Iraqi politics and give Iran huge
Wow.
leverage within that politics.
Wow. So that kind of that leads to my next question, or that kind of answers or gives a preliminary answer to my next question, which was what has been the relationship between Iran and Iraq since then. But it's been one where Iran has been very much involved and has sort of leveraged their influence to get what they want. Is that, or is there anything more to say? Or
Well, except there's one interesting thing, which is, I suppose you're absolutely right, but it's also the fact that there are many Irans in Iraq, and there are many Irans. So if you look at the great shrine cities of Iraq, where the religious scholars exist, the religious authorities, they have strong relations with the religious authorities in Qom and in the clerical regime in Iran. But what's interesting is that they don't all see eye to eye. They all have quite different views. So Sistani, who's the major jurist, Islamic jurist in Iraq, doesn't at all agree with Khamenei and his or Khomeini's view of the rule of the Ayatollahs. Far from it. He's exactly against that. And there are some in Iran who favor that and that the Iranian regime worries about. And they've sometimes persecuted them. So there's a kind of interesting way back and forward. And then there's another part of Iran, which is the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, which is both a commercial organization and a violent organization. So in a sense, it becomes the conduit for help to the militias, but it also becomes one of the major oil smuggling and other smuggling operators in the south of Iraq and down the waters of the Gulf. And it's infiltrated many parts. So influential was it, of course, that the Americans ordered the assassination of Soleimani, who was the head of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. And he was a key commander, a key influence in Iraq. But the irony is that, as in many cases, you assassinate one person and you don't thereby remove the influence. The influence is as strong as ever of the Iranian Revolution. And you have the Iranian government, which has technically very good relations with the Iraqi government. But of course, they all know that underpinning all this is the reality of Iranian power in Iraq. And of course, the Iranian government's always wary of the degree to which Iraq becomes a launching pad for American attacks on itself. So again, it's trying to displace that, and it's got things in presumably prepared to do things about it, but it's still part of that curious ambivalent relationship between the Iraqi government finds itself between the United States and Iran on certain questions.
That is quite the complicated web between these two countries as of right now. So, given the current protests that are going on in Iran and the possibility that some people see for regime change in Iran anyway, if you were in charge of Iraq, what would you be thinking about what's going on in Iran right now?
Well, officially, the Iraqi government is very formally supportive of the Iranian government. So all formal statements are fully supportive, et cetera, et cetera. So clearly, they do not want to suggest at all that they are condoning or supporting the demonstrations or the uprisings against them. And in fact, there have been reports of sightings of quite a large numbers of members of Iraqi militias operating in cities of Western Iran to kill and suppress protesters. Many of these militias are organizations that also have representative in the Iraqi parliament. They are political parties. It's the ballot box in one hand and the gun in the other. So these people, these aren't officially sent there by the Iraqi government, but they're certainly allowed to operate because that's how the Iraqi government operates. It can't disarm the militias, it can't roll them up, and some of them have very influential within the Iraqi government. So it's a bind. So from that point of view, and of course, one shouldn't forget that in 2019, Iraq had its own uprisings for many similar reasons to the Iranian ones, that these were younger generation, fed up the corruption, of the violence, of the sectarianism, of the religious leadership, and they had massive demonstration of the Tishreen movement. And the Iraqi authorities suppressed it with equal violence to the Iranian authorities. Hundreds were killed rather than thousands, perhaps, but still very significant numbers, and targeted assassinations of the organizers. And since then, it's been suppressed in other ways. So the Iraqi government is a government of patrons, elites, and largely, as it were, unanswerable characters who are not willing to expose themselves to the kind of democratic answerability that the Tishreen movement was trying to ask of them. So their view of people demonstrating in the streets asking for the overthrow of the regime is probably quite similar to that of the Iranian leaders as well. Of course, as dependence on aspects of Iranian largesse through weapons, through money, through other forms of influence, they must be quite worried that the Iranian regime may be threatened, if not internally, then externally as well. So that's going to be clearly something that they would be concerned about. But on most counts, you could argue that they are as supportive of the suppression of the Iranian people as they were supportive of the suppression of their own people.
Fascinating. Well, Professor Tripp, thank you so much for your time and your knowledge. Everyone out there, you've now heard the long history short. Make sure you hit like and subscribe.
Thank you very much.